My best friend destroyed my birthday cake and cried because I didn't invite her boyfriend. I announced why she really broke up with the last one. My best friend Cara smashed her fist into the center of my birthday cake at 8:47 p.m. on Saturday night in front of 30 people, and chocolate frosting exploded across the dining room table. She was screaming about how I deliberately excluded her boyfriend Dylan from my party, how I was trying to control her life, and how I was a terrible friend who didn't support her relationship. Her hand went through 3 layers of cake and hit the cardboard base underneath. Frosting splattered onto my dress, my face, the wall behind me. My sister Brooke grabbed Cara's arm and pulled her back while Cara sobbed and yelled that I'd betrayed her. My mom stood frozen with the cake knife still in her hand. My boyfriend Ethan stepped between me and Cara. Dylan wasn't there because I'd specifically told Cara 2 weeks ago that he wasn't invited, and I'd explained exactly why. She'd agreed at the time, said she understood, even apologized for putting me in that position. But apparently she'd changed her mind sometime between then and now, and decided to make my 30th birthday party the venue for her meltdown. I wiped frosting off my face with a napkin, and looked at Cara standing there shaking and crying, and I made a decision. I told everyone in the room that Dylan wasn't invited, because 3 months ago, Cara's previous boyfriend Marcus had called me at 2 in the morning from a hospital. I said Marcus told me Cara had attacked him with a wine bottle during an argument, that he'd needed 12 stitches on his forearm, and that he was terrified of her. The room went completely silent. Cara's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I kept talking. I told them Marcus had begged me not to say anything because Cara had threatened to tell everyone he'd hit her first if he reported what really happened. I said he'd broken up with her the next day and moved to a different city because he was scared of what she'd do if he stayed. I said Cara had told everyone that Marcus ghosted her because he couldn't handle a strong woman, and I'd kept her secret because she was my best friend, and I wanted to believe she'd been defending herself. But then Dylan had called me 6 weeks ago with a similar story. He said Cara had thrown a glass at his head during a fight about him talking to a female coworker. The glass had missed and shattered against the wall. He'd locked himself in the bathroom while she pounded on the door screaming threats. He was afraid of her, but also somehow still convinced he could fix the relationship if he just learned to avoid triggering her temper. I'd told Cara I couldn't watch her hurt another person and that Dylan wasn't welcome at my party until she got help for whatever was making her violent. That's when she'd agreed and apologized and promised to start therapy. Clearly that hadn't happened. Cara started screaming that I was a liar, that Marcus had hit her first and she'd only defended herself, that Dylan was making things up because he wanted to break up with her and needed an excuse. My cousin Jordan pulled out his phone and said he was calling the police because destroying property during a violent outburst was something they should know about. Cara's face went from white to red and she lunged at Jordan. Ethan caught her around the waist and held her back while she thrashed and screamed. My dad told everyone to leave the dining room and go into the living room. Most people moved quickly, but some stood frozen, staring. Cara finally stopped fighting against Ethan and collapsed onto the floor crying. She curled into a ball and sobbed that nobody understood her, that everyone always took everyone else's side, that I'd ruined her life by exposing her secrets. Brooke knelt down next to her and tried to calm her down, but Cara shoved her away. My mom set down the cake knife and left the room looking like she might cry. Ethan let go of Cara and stepped back, keeping himself between her and me. I stood there covered in cake and frosting, looking down at my best friend of 15 years having a breakdown on my dining room floor, and felt absolutely nothing except relief that I'd finally said the truth out loud. Jordan didn't actually call the police, but he held his phone ready in case Cara got violent again. She eventually stopped crying and just lay there on the floor staring at nothing. After about 10 minutes, she sat up and looked at me with red, swollen eyes. She asked in a quiet, broken voice if I really believed she was a violent person. I said I believed she'd hurt Marcus and scared Dylan, and that she needed professional help before she hurt someone else or herself. Cara said I didn't understand what it was like to feel so angry all the time, to have this rage inside that she couldn't control. She said sometimes people pushed her too far and she just snapped. I asked if she heard herself making excuses for violence. She said they weren't excuses, they were explanations. I said there was no explanation that justified attacking someone with a bottle or throwing glass at someone's head. Cara stood up slowly, her legs shaking. She looked around at the destroyed cake, the frosting on the walls and floor, the shocked faces of my family members watching from the living room doorway. She said she was leaving and that I should never contact her again. I said I wouldn't. Cara walked out of my house and I heard her car start a minute later. The engine revved loudly and then faded as she drove away. Brooke came back into the dining room and started cleaning up the cake mess without saying anything. Ethan asked if I was okay and I said I didn't know yet. My dad came in and said that needed to happen eventually, that keeping Cara's violence a secret had been eating at me for months. He said he'd noticed I'd been stressed and distant lately, and now he understood why. I asked how he'd known something was wrong, and he said parents always know, even when their kids try to hide things. My mom returned with wet towels and helped Brooke clean the table. She didn't look at me, and I could tell she was processing everything I'd revealed. My mom had always loved Cara, had thought of her as a second daughter, had welcomed her into our family for 15 years. Learning that Cara had been violent with her boyfriends and that I'd hidden it was probably devastating for her. Jordan asked if I wanted him to actually call the police now and file a report about the cake incident. I said no because I just wanted this night to be over. He said I should at least document what happened in case Cara tried to claim I'd done something to her. I hadn't thought about that possibility but realized he was right. I took photos of the destroyed cake, the frosting on the walls, my dress covered in chocolate. Ethan took photos of the dining room from multiple angles. Brooke suggested I write down exactly what happened while it was fresh in my memory. I sat at the kitchen table and typed out the entire incident on my phone, including timestamps and the names of everyone who'd witnessed it. When I finished, I sent the documentation to my email so I'd have a permanent record. The party was obviously over. The guests who'd retreated to the living room started leaving one by one, each of them stopping to hug me or tell me they were sorry my birthday had been ruined. My aunt pulled me aside and said she'd always thought there was something off about Cara but could never put her finger on it. She said the rage in Cara's eyes when she'd smashed the cake was genuinely frightening. My uncle said he was proud of me for finally standing up to her, that keeping someone's violent behavior secret only enabled them to keep hurting people. By 9:30, everyone except family had left. Brooke ordered pizza because nobody had eaten cake and we were all hungry. We sat in the living room eating and not really talking about what had happened. My younger brother Kevin, who'd been away at college and missed the whole incident, called to wish me happy birthday. Brooke grabbed the phone and told him he'd missed the most dramatic birthday party in family history. I could hear Kevin asking what happened and Brooke gave him a quick summary. He said he was glad I'd finally told the truth about Cara because he'd never liked her anyway. He said she'd always been possessive and controlling with me, getting jealous whenever I spent time with other friends or talked about my life outside our friendship. I'd never noticed that pattern before but realized he was right. Cara had always needed to be the center of my attention, had always made little comments about my other friends not being as close to me as she was, had always acted hurt when I made plans that didn't include her. I'd written it off as her being invested in our friendship, but maybe it had been something darker. Control masked as caring, possessiveness masked as loyalty. I went upstairs to shower and change out of my frosting-covered dress. Standing under the hot water, I finally let myself cry. Not because I missed Cara or regretted what I'd said, but because 15 years of friendship had ended with her fist in a cake and me revealing her darkest secrets to a room full of people. I cried because I'd lost someone who'd been part of my daily life since we were teenagers. I cried because the Cara I thought I knew apparently didn't exist, or had been buried under layers of rage and violence I'd refused to see clearly. When I came back downstairs in clean clothes, my family had cleaned up all the remaining cake mess. The dining room looked normal except for a faint chocolate stain on the wall that my mom said she'd repaint tomorrow. Ethan had gone out and bought a small store cake so we could still do candles and singing. It was a generic sheet cake with "Happy Birthday" written in blue icing. Nothing like the custom 3-layer chocolate cake my mom had ordered from the fancy bakery downtown. But everyone sang and I blew out the candles and we ate cake in the living room while watching a movie nobody paid attention to. Around midnight, people started heading home or to bed. Ethan and I went up to my room and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling. He asked if I wanted to talk about it and I said not really, but thank you for stopping Cara from attacking Jordan. He said he'd never seen that level of rage from someone before, that Cara had looked like she wanted to genuinely hurt people. I said that's what Marcus and Dylan had described too, that switch that flipped and turned her into someone unrecognizable. Ethan asked if I'd ever seen her violent before tonight, and I admitted I'd seen small signs over the years that I'd dismissed. Cara punching a wall during an argument with her college boyfriend. Cara throwing her phone across a room when she was frustrated. Cara grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise when she was trying to make a point during a heated discussion. I'd written those incidents off as isolated moments of stress or passion, but they'd been warnings I'd ignored. Ethan said sometimes we don't want to see the truth about people we love, because accepting it means losing them. I said I'd lost her anyway, and at least now I didn't have to carry her secrets anymore. We fell asleep around 2 in the morning, and I dreamed about cake and broken glass, and Cara's face full of rage. Sunday morning, I woke up to 43 text messages and 12 missed calls. Most were from mutual friends who'd heard about what happened and wanted my side of the story. Apparently, Cara had spent the night texting people her version of events, painting herself as the victim of my cruelty and lies. She'd told people I'd humiliated her at my party by making up stories about her being violent, that I'd done it because I was jealous of her relationship with Dylan, that I'd always been controlling and possessive of her. She'd sent screenshots of old text messages where I'd expressed concern about her relationships, trying to make it look like I was trying to isolate her from boyfriends. Several mutual friends had texted asking if what Cara said was true. I sent them all the same response. Everything I'd said at my party was true, and I had documentation from Marcus and Dylan if they wanted proof. 3 friends immediately asked to see the proof. I forwarded them the text messages Marcus had sent me from the hospital, including a photo he'd taken of his stitched arm. I sent them screenshots of my conversation with Dylan describing the glass-throwing incident and his fear of Cara. I sent them the photos from last night showing my destroyed cake and frosting-covered dining room. One friend, Aisha, called me immediately after seeing the evidence. She was crying and apologizing for believing Cara's version first. She said she'd been friends with Cara longer than she'd known me and had wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Aisha said she felt sick thinking about how she'd defended Cara to other people this morning before seeing the proof, I told her it wasn't her fault for wanting to believe her friend, that I'd done the same thing for months with Marcus. Aisha asked if I thought Cara would actually get help or just keep hurting people. I said I didn't know, but that it wasn't my responsibility to fix her anymore. Another friend, Taylor, texted saying Cara had just posted on social media about toxic friends who betray your trust and spread lies about you. The post didn't name me specifically, but was clearly directed at me. It had already gotten dozens of supportive comments from people who didn't know the real story. Taylor asked if I was going to respond publicly, and I said no, that I'd told the truth to the people who mattered and wasn't interested in social media drama. She said that was probably smart because engaging would just make things worse. But she warned me that Cara was building a narrative where she was the victim, and some people would believe it no matter what evidence I provided. I knew she was right, but decided I didn't care what strangers or distant acquaintances thought about me. The people who really knew me would know the truth. By noon, my phone had mostly stopped buzzing. I'd responded to everyone I wanted to respond to, and ignored the rest. Ethan made breakfast, and we ate on the couch while I told him about Cara's social media campaign. He said it was typical abuser behavior to flip the script and claim they were the real victim. He said his sister had dated someone like that years ago, someone who'd been emotionally and physically abusive but had convinced everyone they were the one being mistreated. It had taken his sister years to get people to believe her because her ex was so good at playing victim. I asked how his sister had finally gotten free, and he said she'd just started living her life and stopped trying to convince anyone of the truth. Eventually, her ex's pattern became obvious to everyone else. Monday morning, I had to go back to work and face my coworkers, several of whom were friends with Cara on social media. I worked as a graphic designer at a marketing firm, and Cara had done freelance photography for some of our campaigns. People at work knew we were best friends and had probably seen her posts. I walked into the office prepared for awkward questions or cold shoulders from people who believed her version. Instead, my boss Diane called me into her office first thing. She closed the door and said she'd heard about what happened at my party through the office gossip chain. She said she wanted me to know that Cara would no longer be hired for any freelance work because the company couldn't risk working with someone who had documented violent tendencies. I was shocked that Diane had heard the story so quickly, and that she was taking it seriously. Diane said one of the party guests was her neighbor and had told her everything. She said she'd also heard from Marcus, who'd worked at our company 2 years ago before moving. Marcus had reached out to her Sunday night after mutual friends told him I'd finally revealed what Cara had done to him. He'd sent Diane the hospital records and photos from the night Cara attacked him. He'd said he wanted to make sure our company knew the truth in case Cara tried to sue me for defamation or damage to her freelance career. I hadn't even thought about the possibility of Cara suing me, but apparently Marcus had. Diane said Marcus had also offered to provide a formal statement if I ever needed it. She gave me his new phone number and said he wanted to talk to me. I thanked Diane and went back to my desk feeling overwhelmed. The idea that Marcus had been monitoring the situation and had proactively contacted my boss to protect me was unexpected and touching. He'd been through something traumatic and had moved away to escape it, but he'd still taken the time to make sure I had support. I called Marcus during my lunch break. He answered on the second ring and said he'd been hoping I'd reach out. His voice sounded different than I remembered, quieter and more cautious. He asked how I was holding up after Saturday night, and I said I was okay, mostly relieved that the truth was finally out. Marcus said he'd spent the past 2 days thinking about whether he should have said something publicly months ago, but that he'd been too scared of Cara's retaliation. He said reading that she'd destroyed my birthday cake and attacked me the same way she'd attacked him made him realize she hadn't changed at all. I told him about Dylan and the glass-throwing incident, and Marcus went quiet for a long moment. Then he said he'd actually heard from Dylan last week. Dylan had somehow tracked him down through mutual connections and had asked if Cara had been violent with him too. Marcus had confirmed it and had encouraged Dylan to leave the relationship before it escalated further. Dylan had said he was trying to help Cara get therapy, and Marcus had told him that wasn't his responsibility, that he needed to protect himself first. Marcus asked if Dylan had ended up leaving, and I said I didn't know, that I hadn't heard from Dylan since our conversation 6 weeks ago. Marcus said he'd try to reach out to Dylan again and see if he was safe. We talked for another 20 minutes about our respective experiences with Cara. Marcus described the night she'd attacked him in detail. They'd been arguing about him wanting to spend time with his friends without her. She'd accused him of cheating and not prioritizing their relationship. When he'd said he needed space, she'd grabbed a wine bottle from the counter and swung it at him. He'd thrown up his arm to protect his face, and the bottle had shattered against his forearm, slicing it open. Cara had immediately started crying and apologizing, saying she didn't mean to, that she'd just been so angry and scared of losing him. She'd driven him to the hospital, but had insisted on a story about him cutting himself while doing dishes. The ER nurse had looked skeptical, but hadn't pushed when Marcus had confirmed the story. Marcus said he'd lied because Cara had been sobbing in the waiting room, and he'd felt guilty for making her upset. Looking back, he realized how manipulated he'd been. The next morning, Cara had brought him breakfast in bed and had been sweet and apologetic. But when he'd said he needed time to think about their relationship, she'd switched instantly to rage. She'd told him if he left her or told anyone what really happened, she'd tell everyone he'd been the violent one. She'd said people would believe her because she was small and emotional, and he was a man. She'd said she'd show people bruises and scratches she could easily create herself. Marcus had been terrified because he'd known she was right. People would believe her version over his. So he'd moved to a different city within a month and had cut off contact with everyone who knew her. He'd rebuilt his life slowly and had been doing okay until he'd heard about Saturday night. Now he was worried about Dylan and about whether Cara would hurt someone else. I asked Marcus if he'd ever considered filing a police report, and he said he'd thought about it constantly, but was afraid it would make things worse. I said I understood that fear, but wondered if we had a responsibility to document her pattern of violence, so future victims would be believed. Marcus said that was a hard question, and he'd been wrestling with it all weekend. We agreed to think about it and talk again soon. When I got home from work that evening, Ethan was in the kitchen making dinner. He said Dylan had called him that afternoon. Apparently, Dylan and Ethan had exchanged numbers weeks ago when Dylan had first reached out to me about Cara. Dylan had wanted Ethan's perspective as another man who was close to the situation. Ethan said Dylan had sounded terrible on the phone, exhausted and scared. Dylan had broken up with Cara yesterday after hearing about the birthday cake incident. He'd texted her saying the relationship was over and had immediately blocked her number. But Cara had shown up at his apartment last night and had pounded on his door for over an hour, screaming and crying and threatening to hurt herself if he didn't talk to her. Dylan had called the police, who'd made Cara leave but had told him there wasn't much they could do unless she actually harmed him or herself. Dylan was staying with friends now because he was afraid Cara would come back. He'd asked Ethan if he should file a restraining order, and Ethan had said yes. Ethan had offered to go with Dylan to the courthouse later this week for moral support. I asked Ethan if Dylan knew about Marcus, and he said yes. That Marcus had called Dylan this morning and they'd talked for over an hour. They were apparently planning to file police reports together, creating a documented pattern that would make it easier to get the restraining order approved. I felt this strange mix of emotions hearing about Marcus and Dylan connecting and supporting each other. Part of me was glad they'd found solidarity, but another part felt guilty that my birthday party meltdown had become the catalyst for all of this. Ethan said I shouldn't feel guilty for telling the truth, that Cara's actions had consequences, and those consequences were hers to deal with. Wednesday evening, my mom called and said we needed to talk about something serious. She asked if I could come over, and I drove to my parents' house, wondering what new development had occurred. When I arrived, both my parents were sitting in the living room looking somber. My dad said they'd received a certified letter that afternoon from an attorney representing Cara. The letter stated that Cara was pursuing a defamation lawsuit against me for making false statements that had damaged her reputation and business. The letter demanded I issue a public apology and retraction, pay $50,000 in damages, and cease all contact with her former boyfriends who were spreading coordinated lies about her. My stomach dropped. I'd known this was a possibility but had hoped Cara wouldn't actually go through with it. My mom said the letter had listed specific damages including lost freelance photography contracts, emotional distress, and damage to her social and professional reputation. The attorney had given me 2 weeks to respond to their demands, or they'd file a formal lawsuit. My dad said I needed to get a lawyer immediately. He'd already called a friend who practiced civil litigation and had gotten a referral to someone who specialized in defamation defense. I had an appointment with the attorney, Leonard Zhao, Thursday afternoon. I asked my parents if they thought Cara actually had a case, and my dad said it didn't matter if she had a case. It mattered that she had a lawyer willing to pursue it. Even if she lost eventually, the legal process would be expensive and stressful. My mom looked upset and said she couldn't believe Cara was doing this after everything she'd done. She said she'd thought of Cara as family, and this felt like a betrayal. I reminded my mom that Cara had smashed my birthday cake and tried to attack Jordan, that filing a frivolous lawsuit was consistent with her pattern of retaliation when people held her accountable. My mom said she knew that intellectually but emotionally was still processing the loss of someone she'd loved like a daughter. Thursday afternoon, I met with Leonard Zhao in his downtown office. He was in his 50s, calm and professional, and spent an hour asking me detailed questions about everything that had happened. I showed him all my documentation, the texts from Marcus, the messages from Dylan, the photos from my birthday party, the written account I'd typed up that night, the hospital records Marcus had provided. Leonard reviewed everything carefully and then said Cara's lawsuit had no merit. Everything I'd said at my party was true, and I had multiple sources of evidence to prove it. Truth was an absolute defense against defamation claims. He said the bigger concern was that Cara's attorney had filed this knowing it was frivolous, which suggested they were either incompetent or betting I'd settle out of fear of the legal process. Leonard said his strategy would be to respond to the demand letter with our own evidence, make it clear we had no intention of settling, and inform Cara's attorney that if they proceeded with filing a formal lawsuit, we'd pursue sanctions for bringing a frivolous claim. He said most attorneys would back off at that point rather than risk professional consequences. I asked what would happen if Cara's attorney didn't back off, and Leonard said we'd file a motion to dismiss and let a judge see all the evidence. He was confident any judge would throw the case out immediately. Leonard said his retainer was $5,000, and he estimated the total cost would be between $7,000 and $10,000 if we had to go to court. I felt sick hearing those numbers, but knew I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let Cara's threats force me to lie and say I'd made everything up. That would betray Marcus and Dylan and anyone else she might hurt in the future. I signed the retainer agreement and wrote a check that would completely drain my savings account. Leonard said he'd draft a response letter immediately and have it delivered to Cara's attorney by Monday. He advised me not to respond to any communication from Cara or her attorney directly, that everything should go through him. Friday morning, I woke up to discover Cara had escalated her social media campaign. She'd posted a long statement saying I'd been jealous of her relationships for years, that I'd deliberately tried to sabotage every boyfriend she'd had, and that when she'd finally stood up to me at my birthday party, I'd retaliated by making up horrific lies and turning everyone against her. She'd included carefully edited screenshots of old text conversations that made me look possessive and controlling. She'd left out all the context showing I'd been concerned about her well-being and her violent behavior. The post had hundreds of comments, most supporting Cara and calling me terrible names. A few of our mutual friends had commented defending me and providing context, but they were being attacked by Cara's supporters who didn't know the full story. I knew I should ignore it like Taylor had advised, but I couldn't stop reading the comments. People were calling me a jealous, manipulative liar. They were saying I was the real abuser and Cara was lucky to be free of me. They were saying I'd probably made up the Marcus and Dylan stories to cover my own abusive behavior. I called Ethan crying and he came over immediately. He made me close the social media app and told me nothing good would come from reading those comments. He reminded me that people who actually knew me knew the truth. He said Cara was grasping at straws because her world was falling apart, and blaming me was easier than taking responsibility. That evening, Aisha called sounding upset. She said Cara had been messaging her all day, trying to convince her that I was lying about everything. Cara had sent Aisha the same edited text screenshots and had claimed Marcus and Dylan were both lying because I'd manipulated them into supporting my false narrative. Aisha said she'd told Cara she'd seen the actual evidence and knew the truth, and Cara had lost it. Cara had sent Aisha dozens of messages calling her a traitor, saying she was a terrible friend, saying everyone was conspiring against her. Aisha had finally blocked Cara's number because the messages were becoming unhinged. Aisha said several of their other mutual friends had also blocked Cara after receiving similar message barrages. She said Cara was isolating herself by attacking anyone who didn't immediately take her side. Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after my birthday party, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Dylan. He sounded stressed and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. He said he'd filed a police report Wednesday describing the glass-throwing incident and Cara's harassment after their breakup. The police had told him the same thing they'd told him before, that unless Cara actually hurt him or herself, there wasn't much they could do. But now he had an official report on file. Marcus had also filed a report about the wine bottle attack, even though it had happened months ago. The detective had told them that having 2 documented incidents from 2 different victims created a pattern that would help if either of them wanted to pursue charges or restraining orders. Dylan said he was filing for a restraining order Monday morning, and Marcus was considering doing the same, even though he lived in a different city. Dylan asked if I'd be willing to provide a statement about what Cara had done at my birthday party. He said it would help establish her pattern of violent outbursts when confronted with accountability. I told Dylan about the defamation lawsuit and said I was worried that providing a statement might be used against me somehow. Dylan said he understood and didn't want to make my situation worse, but he also said that if people kept protecting themselves by staying quiet, Cara would keep hurting people without consequences. I knew he was right. I told Dylan I'd talk to my attorney Monday and see what he advised. Dylan thanked me and said something that stuck with me. He said he'd been researching abusive relationships all week and had learned that abusers rarely change without serious intervention. He said Cara had shown no sign of taking responsibility or seeking help. She was just attacking everyone who tried to hold her accountable. He said he was terrified that she'd hurt someone worse next time, that the violence would escalate until someone ended up seriously injured or dead. His words made me feel cold. I'd been so focused on protecting myself legally that I hadn't fully considered the bigger picture. If Cara kept dating people and kept having violent episodes, what would happen when wine bottles and glasses weren't enough to express her rage? Monday morning, Leonard called to tell me he'd sent the response letter to Cara's attorney. The letter laid out all our evidence in detail and made it clear we had no intention of settling or apologizing. It stated that the defamation claim was frivolous and that if Cara's attorney proceeded with filing a formal lawsuit, we'd seek sanctions. Leonard said he expected to hear back within a few days. He also said that if I wanted to provide a statement to help Dylan and Marcus, it wouldn't hurt my case because everything I'd said was documented and true. I called Dylan and told him I'd provide a statement. He gave me the detective's contact information, and I called that afternoon. Detective Andrea Wolf was professional and thorough. She asked me to describe exactly what happened at my birthday party, what I knew about Marcus and Dylan's experiences, and what Cara had said and done. I walked her through everything chronologically, and she took detailed notes. She said having a third-party witness confirm the pattern was very helpful for Dylan's restraining order petition. She also said that if Cara continued to harass Dylan or showed up at his apartment again, Dylan should call 911 immediately and reference the case number from his police report. Detective Wolf said she'd seen cases like this before where someone had clear violent tendencies but hadn't done anything quite serious enough for criminal charges. She said it was frustrating because often the system couldn't intervene until someone got seriously hurt. She said the best thing Marcus and Dylan could do was document everything and stay away from Cara completely. Wednesday afternoon, Leonard called with an update. Cara's attorney had responded to our letter with a much more conciliatory tone. They were now saying Cara just wanted me to stop talking to Marcus and Dylan, and that if I agreed to cease contact with them, they'd drop the defamation demand. Leonard said this was a significant retreat from their original demands and showed they'd realized their case was weak, but he advised against accepting any agreement that restricted who I could talk to, because it would set a precedent that Cara could control my relationships through legal threats. I agreed, and told Leonard to respond that I'd have contact with whoever I chose, and that Cara's attorney should advise her to stop harassing her ex-boyfriends if she wanted to avoid further legal problems. Leonard said he'd send that response immediately. That evening, I got a call from Marcus. He sounded excited and said his restraining order petition had been approved. The judge had reviewed the police report, hospital records, and my statement, and had granted a temporary restraining order. Cara was prohibited from contacting Marcus or coming within 500 feet of him for the next year. Marcus said he'd been shocked at how quickly it was approved, but the judge had apparently seen enough evidence of violence and harassment to take it seriously. Marcus asked if I'd heard about Dylan's petition, and I said no. Marcus said Dylan's hearing was scheduled for Friday, and that between my statement, Marcus's corroborating evidence, and the police report from the apartment harassment, Dylan's attorney was confident it would be approved. I asked Marcus how he felt now that he had legal protection, and he said relieved but also angry that it had taken this long. He said if he'd filed a police report the night Cara attacked him, maybe she wouldn't have gone on to hurt Dylan. I told him that wasn't his fault, that he'd been traumatized and scared and had done what he needed to do to survive. Marcus said he knew that intellectually but still felt guilty. We talked for a while about guilt and responsibility, and the ways abuse victims often blame themselves. It was a heavy conversation, but also cathartic. Friday afternoon, Dylan texted that his restraining order had been approved. He sent a photo of the official court document. Cara was prohibited from contacting him or coming within 1,000 feet of his home or workplace for 2 years. The judge had apparently been disturbed by the pattern of violence and had asked Dylan if he felt safe. Dylan had admitted he didn't, and the judge had extended the distance requirement and duration beyond what was typical. Dylan said his attorney had told him the judge had seen too many cases where restraining orders weren't taken seriously, and victims ended up hurt. This judge wasn't taking any chances. Saturday morning, exactly 2 weeks after my birthday party, I woke up to dozens of text messages and missed calls. Something had happened overnight. I called Brooke back first and she was crying. She said Cara had been arrested late last night for violating Dylan's restraining order. Cara had shown up at Dylan's friend's house around midnight, apparently having figured out where he was staying. She'd been drunk and had pounded on the door screaming for Dylan to talk to her. The friend had called 911 and Cara had been arrested for violating the restraining order, public intoxication, and disorderly conduct. She'd spent the night in jail and was being arraigned Monday morning. Brooke said our mutual friends were in shock because Cara had posted about the restraining orders on social media Friday night, calling them part of the conspiracy against her. She'd said she was going to prove everyone was lying. Apparently, her way of proving that was to immediately violate the order. I felt this strange numbness hearing the news. Part of me was glad Cara was facing legal consequences, but another part was sad that our 15-year friendship had ended with her in jail. Ethan said it wasn't my fault she'd made these choices, that I'd actually tried to help her by keeping her secrets until she'd forced my hand. He was right, but it still hurt. Monday morning, Leonard called with unexpected news. Cara's attorney had withdrawn from her case. He'd sent Leonard a brief letter stating he was no longer representing Cara, effective immediately. Leonard said this usually meant either the client couldn't pay, or the attorney had realized the case was unwinnable and didn't want to waste more time on it. Either way, the defamation threat was essentially over unless Cara found a new attorney willing to take her case. Leonard said that was unlikely given her recent arrest and the documented evidence against her. I asked if I needed to do anything else legally, and Leonard said no. We were done unless Cara filed something new. I paid his remaining bill and felt relieved that at least the legal stress was over. That afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Cara's mother, Susan. I hadn't spoken to Susan since before my birthday party. Susan was crying and asking me to drop the restraining orders and stop encouraging Marcus and Dylan to press charges. She said Cara was her only daughter and was going through a mental health crisis and needed help, not legal problems. I told Susan gently but firmly that I hadn't filed any restraining orders, that Marcus and Dylan had done that themselves because they were afraid of Cara. I said I couldn't control what they did and that they had every right to protect themselves. Susan said I'd turned everyone against Cara by spreading lies, and now her daughter's life was ruined. I said I'd told the truth about Cara's violence, and that if her life was ruined, it was because of her own actions. Susan started crying harder and said she'd raised Cara better than this, that she didn't understand where all the anger came from. I asked if Cara had ever been violent at home, and Susan went quiet for a long moment. Then she admitted that Cara had punched holes in walls as a teenager when she was upset. Susan had taken her to therapy for a few months, but Cara had refused to keep going. Susan had hoped she'd grow out of it. I said maybe it was time to revisit therapy now, that court-ordered counseling might actually help Cara more than enabling her had. Susan said she'd tried to get Cara to go back to therapy recently, but Cara had refused, saying there was nothing wrong with her. Susan sounded defeated and exhausted. Before we hung up, Susan asked if I thought Cara could get better. I said I didn't know, but that she'd need to want to change and be willing to do the hard work. Susan thanked me for being honest and said she was sorry about my birthday cake. It was a small thing to apologize for given everything else, but I appreciated it anyway. Wednesday morning, I received an email from Dylan. He'd written a long message describing his arraignment and what had happened. Cara had been charged with violating the restraining order, a misdemeanor that carried potential jail time. Her public defender had tried to argue that she'd been drunk and hadn't understood what she was doing, but the judge had pointed out that she'd posted about the restraining order on social media just hours before violating it. She'd clearly known it existed. The judge had set bail at $10,000 and had ordered Cara to have no contact with Dylan, Marcus, or me. She was also ordered to undergo a mental health evaluation and substance abuse assessment. If she violated the order again, she'd face felony charges. Dylan said watching Cara in court had been surreal. She'd looked small and scared in her orange jumpsuit, nothing like the rage-filled person who'd thrown glass at him or destroyed my cake. But Dylan said he'd reminded himself that looking vulnerable didn't mean she wasn't dangerous. He said he'd learned that abusers often appeared sympathetic in court, that it was part of how they'd manipulated people for so long. Susan had apparently posted Cara's bail and she was released Wednesday afternoon with conditions. She had to check in with a probation officer weekly, attend mandatory counseling, and submit to random alcohol testing. She was also prohibited from using social media to post about anyone involved in the case. Thursday evening, Taylor called and said Cara had reached out to her despite the court order not to contact me. Cara had sent Taylor a long message asking her to give me a letter. Taylor had refused and had told Cara that contacting anyone connected to me probably violated her probation conditions. Cara had responded with angry messages calling Taylor another traitor. Taylor had screenshot everything and had sent it to both Dylan's attorney and the probation office. She said she wasn't taking any chances that Cara would try to use her as a go-between to harass people. Taylor said several other mutual friends had received similar messages from Cara and had also reported them. It seemed like Cara was systematically burning every bridge she had left. A month passed. I heard through my family that Cara had moved back in with her parents because she couldn't afford her apartment after losing most of her freelance clients. Susan had called my mom once to say Cara was attending court-ordered therapy and had been diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder and borderline personality traits. She was on medication and supposedly doing better. My mom had been sympathetic but had maintained firm boundaries about not facilitating any contact between Cara and me. I went back to therapy myself to process everything that had happened. My therapist, Dr. Nina Reeves, helped me understand that I'd been in a codependent friendship where I'd enabled Cara's behavior by keeping her secrets and making excuses for her. She said learning to set boundaries and prioritize my own well-being over protecting someone else's image had been healthy, even though it had been painful. Dr. Reeves also helped me process the guilt I felt about the way everything had exploded so publicly. She said that wasn't my fault, that Cara had created the public spectacle by destroying my cake and attacking me at my own party. I just responded honestly in the moment. 2 months after my birthday, Marcus called and said he'd heard from Cara's therapist. Apparently, as part of Cara's treatment, she was supposed to make amends to people she'd harmed. The therapist had asked if Marcus would be willing to receive a letter from Cara. Marcus had consulted with his attorney and his own therapist before agreeing. He'd received the letter last week and had called to read parts of it to me. Cara had written that she took full responsibility for attacking Marcus with the wine bottle. She'd acknowledged that she'd lied about what happened and had threatened him to keep him silent. She'd said she'd been dealing with uncontrolled rage and fear of abandonment that had made her act in ways she was now horrified by. She'd said she was working hard in therapy to understand her triggers and develop healthy coping mechanisms. She'd said she understood if Marcus could never forgive her, but she wanted him to know she was genuinely sorry and was committed to never hurting anyone again. Marcus said he didn't know how to feel about the letter. Part of him wanted to believe Cara was really changing, but another part remembered how she'd seemed genuinely remorseful right after attacking him, only to turn threatening the next day. His therapist had told him it was okay to acknowledge her apology without reconciling or trusting her again. Marcus said that's what he planned to do. He'd written a brief response thanking Cara for her apology and saying he hoped she continued to get help, but making it clear he wanted no further contact. Dylan received a similar letter and had a similar response. He told me he was glad Cara was getting help, but wasn't interested in any kind of relationship with her, even a friendly one. 3 months after my birthday, I ran into Susan at the grocery store. It was awkward, but she approached me first and asked if we could talk for a minute. We stood by the produce section and she told me Cara was doing much better. She'd been in therapy 3 times a week and had stayed on her medication. She'd completed her court-ordered programs, and her probation would end soon if she didn't have any more incidents. Susan said Cara had written me a letter too, but understood I probably didn't want to receive it. I said Susan was right, that I wasn't ready for contact with Cara yet, and might never be. Susan said she understood, and just wanted me to know Cara was taking responsibility and working hard to change. I said I was glad to hear that, but needed to protect my own peace. Susan nodded and said she didn't blame me. Before we parted, Susan said something unexpected. She said she was sorry for all the years she'd made excuses for Cara's behavior instead of getting her real help. She said she'd seen the warning signs as Cara grew up, but had convinced herself it was just teenage emotions or stress. She'd enabled Cara by always taking her side and never holding her accountable. She said she'd failed her daughter by not being a stronger parent, and now Cara was paying the price. I told Susan that acknowledging that took courage, and that supporting Cara in getting real help now was what mattered. 6 months after my birthday, Ethan and I got engaged. We'd been planning it before the whole Cara situation had exploded, but he'd waited until things calmed down to propose. He took me to the same restaurant where we'd had our first date and asked me to marry him with a ring his grandmother had left him. I said yes immediately. We celebrated with my family and close friends, and for the first time in months, I felt purely happy without any shadow of drama or conflict hanging over me. Planning the wedding became a welcome distraction from everything that had happened. Brooke was my maid of honor, and Aisha and Taylor were bridesmaids. We spent weekends looking at venues and tasting cakes and choosing flowers. My mom was in her element, helping with all the details. My dad joked that at least this party wouldn't end with destroyed desserts. It felt good to laugh about it, to have enough distance to see the absurdity of what had happened. Almost a year after my birthday party, I heard through Taylor that Cara had moved to a different state. She'd gotten a job working for a nonprofit and was apparently doing well in her continued therapy. She'd stayed on her medication and hadn't had any violent incidents in months. Taylor said she'd run into Cara's cousin who'd told her all this. The cousin had said Cara talked about that night at my party as the wake-up call she'd needed. That hitting rock bottom had forced her to finally get real help. I didn't know how to feel about being someone's rock bottom, but I was glad she was getting help. I hoped she really was changing and wouldn't hurt anyone else, but I also knew I'd never have a relationship with her again. Too much had happened, too much trust had been broken. Some friendships don't survive the truth coming out, and ours was one of them. My wedding day was perfect. The weather was beautiful, the ceremony was emotional, and the reception was full of dancing and laughter. When it came time to cut the cake, everyone joked about protecting it from destruction. Ethan and I cut it together and fed each other small bites and didn't smash it in each other's faces. It was a 3-layer vanilla cake with raspberry filling, completely different from the chocolate cake Cara had destroyed. Everything about the day felt like a new beginning, a line drawn between the chaos of the past year and the future Ethan and I were building together. As I danced with my new husband surrounded by people who loved and supported us, I realized I'd learned something important. Sometimes protecting yourself means losing people you love. And that's okay, because not everyone deserves access to your life, and the people who truly matter will stand by you when you finally tell the truth. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.